was back in New Zealand. I had gone through early psychosis intervention, so epi. And at the end of that relationship, the psychologist, I think, I might be misspeaking there, but the person I was working with who was seeing me on a weekly basis ended that I was aging out of the service, and at 25. And she mentioned, she was like, really enjoyed the time together, all of that kind of stuff. Da, 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 da. Here are the next steps. We're going to make sure that you have someone that this continues, which was wonderful. Epi in general was wonderful. And at the end, our very last session together, she says, I just want to let you know as well, obviously, I can't make that decision. I don't have the power to change the actual diagnosis. I think schizophrenia was wrong, and you don't have to do anything about it, but I just wanted to let you know. It started off as an actor. I really wanted to be an actor when I was young. I didn't have an aptitude for school, at least not when I was in high school or primary school. And I didn't know what I wanted to do. I knew I kind of performing. I think I was a bit of an attention seeker. As a kid, I think one of the ways that I would go around that was through performing, different kinds of performing. And then, yeah, so I started off as an actor. Like, as I started doing that and as I got a little bit older, I realized I wasn't a very good actor, was good enough to kind of get by in certain roles in certain kind of spaces. There were technical reasons why, or technical skills that I wasn't very apt at for acting specifically, but I started to realize, oh, I can hold a space pretty well. Like I can facilitate and I can perform in different ways. And even if some of the technical stuff isn't happening, I know that people are still engaged with something. And I didn't know what it was, but I knew that it was kind of there. So I shifted a little bit. I shifted from acting into, which I'd had moderate kind of success in, but not to the level that I kind of wanted to. And so I shifted a little bit. And towards the end of my studies, I shifted into directing, which I loved, went much better than the acting and performing ever did. That everything that had kind of tripped me up in performance and acting, because I was a very anxious actor, and a lot of the spaces that you're kind of thrown into, the expectation is like, cool, you are performing for us, you have a very short amount of time, and you have to make an impression, like you have to make a bold choice, and you have to make an impression, and you have to da da da. And not many environments where that was being asked of me suited the kind of anxiety and social ineptitude or kind of introversion that I also kind of experienced. And I realized that, yeah, I didn't have that technical ability. I could hold a space. And so okay, try directing, give directing a go. And I realized that in directing and holding space, and that was in a theatrical context specifically, but in holding space, I realized I could create an environment where other people wouldn't feel the same way that I felt going into it. So I went into directing specifically with the mindset of like, I never want an actor or anyone involved in the process to feel the way that I felt going into it. Because acting was horrific. Acting was, you'd have 5-minute audition, 15-minute audition, where you have like a paragraph of text to make an offer with. And that 15 minutes of time in the actual room would have a week's worth of panic and anxiety and sleepless nights and not eating beforehand and just dread, feelings of dread. And I quickly learned, cool, I'm not suited to this kind of like process. And obviously like that process isn't going to change. But if I step into this directing role, I can have an influence on the way that I would hold that space and hold that relationship instead. And so yeah, that kind of like shifted that journey. I think on that idea of it being judged quite harshly, I think acting has an ego reward that comes with it. Earlier on in my kind of like building a skill set and a practice, I became aware of roles in theater, but also I think universally, like mental health sector has this as well, right? Certain roles have an ego reward and it is a reward, like getting to inhabit the spaces an actor does and the visibility that it has is like, there's a feeling of joy that comes with that. Like it feels good. The double-edged sword aspect of it and the downside of it is that when people see someone in a position where they have that reward, I think there can be a tendency to judge them quite harshly or in interesting and quite specific ways, especially in New Zealand, where kind of like the tall poppy syndrome thing is such a phenomenon. Like seeing someone in a position where they stand to gain a sense of like recognition in public or visible kind of recognition. It's quite common to see people jumping on that more harshly than they would other roles and also justify it a little bit. You know, this idea of like, oh, you're an actor, like you have people adoring you, you have people celebrating you. What do you mean you can't take a little bit of feedback? You can't take a little bit of honesty? Even though like the level of critique, the level of honesty is so much higher and more just openly given than it would be for other other roles, right? And yeah, we justify it with the sense of like, oh, you get to be the actor though. You get to be the actor, so you also get to deal with this critique as well from arts world into mental health world. Knowing that I don't come from a specialist kind of background in that, so I don't have kind of psychological knowledge or psychiatric knowledge. That's not where my skill set kind of lies. But having lived experience and having that specific expertise and that specific knowledge, I think a lot of the conversations that we have are, especially now actually, and where the sector is heading with lived experience, a lot of the conversations that we're having are around what is our expertise, what are the strengths of that expertise, like which we've been doing for the past 20, 50 god years, like arguing for why lived experience knowledge is valuable. I think something that we're starting to see more and more as well is like, how do we actually start archiving that? How do we start framing it and writing it down and presenting it in a way that can be shared for other people as well? And that like that line between lived experience knowledge and clinical knowledge or psychiatric knowledge or psychological knowledge is, yeah, we're kind of entering into that realm as well. Myself and my coworker Megan, we were at a conference the beginning of this week, and we were speaking about lived experience and lived experience expertise, and that word expertise and knowledge, I think, is framing a lot of what we're doing at the moment. Like stressing in the way that we frame the work that we do, like stressing the fact that we are speaking to expert knowledge when we talk about community experiences. My avenue into it was through theater. And essentially, like when I say theater, I essentially mean storytelling. Storytelling in the sense of like, how do people use language and use narrative and the different forms that narrative can take to connect, to share stories, share information, also to kind of influence the world around them, like the impact of stories to change the world as well in specific ways, as well as kind of the advocacy sense, but also, you know, like a child coming home at school and asking their parents for snack, like that, there's storytelling in that. You know, like the way a kid will ask to go out and play with their friends or a snack from the fridge before dinner time, that has storytelling in it. The way that a co-worker will describe their workload so that they can advocate for getting like time off at a specific time of it. You know, like there's storytelling in that. There's storytelling as a strategy to influence the direction of things and kind of change the world in that specific sense. Like those processes on a big sense, on a small micro sense, like that's what's always kind of fascinated me. And theater, I mean, theater has a whole load of that, and storytelling and the skills of storytelling are kind of the world of theater and performance. And to be honest, like my work in theater and starting there has had more benefit, I think, for my work in mental health than my sociology degree. And I love my sociology degree. Yeah, the theater work has always been kind of more influential. The majority of my work has always been performance, facilitating, or program delivery. So it's always been some kind of holding relationship, holding people, or holding space, or a combination of the three. And it's quite people, I think, see me in those roles, and the expectation or the assumption is sometimes, oh, you must be very good with people. You must be very sociable. You must be extroverted. Da, da. And the opposite is true. The opposite is true. I am a massive introvert. I like people, but I like, in terms of like my personal enjoyment, like alone time, time in nature, time with books. Big reader is where I spend a lot of my like personal time. But I stepped into those kind of roles, I think, because one, again, like the anxiety thing, I noticed that I wasn't a natural at them. Like I was quite awkward. I was quite anxious. I was very anxious in some instances. I wanted to understand that for myself better. I wanted that to be an easier process for myself. And then also seeing it in others, I wanted to make sure that the way that I was showing up to a space contributed to that space in a way that other people wouldn't feel the same way. The varied success and varied levels of kind of involvement. Yeah, my entry point has always been from the view of I am not good at this. I'm not a natural at this. So I want to get better. I want to focus on it. And I want to make sure other people who also find it tricky have an easier experience because of the way that I show up. A lot of people, especially actually a lot of people in the arts and a lot of people in mental health as well. There's a lot of crossover. I think introverts who can do extroversion well is a really common trait. Like people who recharge and find personal enjoyment in quite solitary experiences and that personal time, but still have the skill sets and have the technical ability and aptitude for activities and spaces and skills that we would associate with extroverted people. Because I used to feel quite guilty about it as well. Especially when I was younger, I used to feel like I should be able to do the social thing. I should be going to parties. I should be doing um, the kind of stereotypical kind of expectation for young people, especially young people in the arts, like that expectation of, oh, you work in theater, like there must be drinks afterwards, there must be cocaine happening in the back room, there must be, which was happening, but it was never something, it was never something that I was particularly interested in. I didn't have any kind of judgment towards it, but it wasn't just something that I was pulled towards. It also just wasn't something that I was invited into a whole lot because I was quite anxious, was quite introverted, and interaction when it wasn't in like a curated session, like if I wasn't working, um I am quite an awkward person, and that's gotten me into trouble a few times, like when people teaching or facilitating or performing, and then sometimes you have this thing where people come up afterwards and they're expecting the same kind of persona, they're expecting the same person identity in front of them, and they get met with a kind of awkward, bumbling, doesn't quite know when to speak, doesn't like know when to jump into conversation, or um I think that can like throw people off sometimes. Yeah. All of that to say, no, old person I think is definitely a compliment. I'm quickly realizing that that's okay to exist in that space of like actually going home and having a book and watching a TV show, spending my weekends going into the park and having time alone is actually fine. I've always been an anxious person to the point where at times, less so nowadays, but early on in my life, like quite debilitating. I was the sort of person where if I was invited to something or if I was going into something, like I would stand outside for 20 minutes before I walk in and just prepare myself, or I would arrive an hour early and I would go for a walk around the place where the stuff would be happening. And I'd be kind of like shaking and breathing and trying to control my thoughts at the same time. And that has always been a part of my experience. Always been a part of my experience. I think that, that ironically going into kind of performance a little bit, because the thing about acting and the thing about those roles again is that because they are constructed, they are specifically designed spaces where you can exist more freely. Like the skill sets involved in them are around easing tension, are around speaking up, are around using your body, they're around expression. And I think one of the reasons I stepped into those spaces was because it was that those skills were inaccessible in my regular living, but I was able to step into those and kind of inhabit that for a short amount of time, and that was really freeing. And so even in the performance, mental health and that kind of that experience of feeling quite trapped when I wasn't performing, when I wasn't in a project, when I wasn't working, that influenced a lot of the work that I want to do. I wanted to explore mental health, to explore personal identity and humanity and the barriers that people have stepping into it. I felt more myself when I was performing on stage than I was in my everyday life, by far, by a large margin. And yeah, so I like moving into like that connection was always there, I think, between performance and mental health. I shifted into directing when I was I did my master's. I ended up doing my master's in, the degree was called text and performance. It was in London, and it was a mixture of a range of things, but theory, scene study, dramaturgy, writing and directing predominantly. And writing and directing, you kind of had to choose between. You had two kind of key modules in my master's, and most people did one. And there were a couple of people who did one of each, one writing module, one directing module. And I went into it thinking I want to do two directing. I did not think of myself as a writer. I did not think of myself as using language in a written format at that time. And because of the numbers, because of some of the kind of practical admin stuff, I think I ended up doing one writing module and one directing. Even I asked for two directing and they were like, no, we'll give you one of each. And I remember it's funny. The masters were split into three terms, and so the first term you did some of everything. The second term you made your decision and you did directing, writing, directing, right, blah blah, some combination. And so after that first module, it became time to pick what you wanted to do, and I wrote down to directing. After having a really good experience with the writing teacher in that first module, he's passed unfortunately now, but wonderful man, very grumpy, had a very mixed reputation in the school. Some of us loved him, some of us despised him. He was known for being very, very blunt. And I remember we got along fine. And I remember in that second term, I put down directing twice, and he came up to me afterwards as they were handing it out, and he was like, "Just so you know, you're going to be in my writing class for the first semester. Sorry." And he walked away. Nope, literally. And I thought, oh God, I've screwed it. I thought I had absolutely ruined my relationship with this man. My first idea for my master's thesis was to write around sexuality, specifically around asexuality as well in that world, which I was kind of experimenting with that kind of label and identity for myself. And then we went through that second module and it went really well. And then the third one, it came time and I did directing. So I moved back into that and it was wonderful. It was, both of them were really excellent teachers. In between the second and third, because in the third you also started working on your thesis. Between that, I ended up being mugged in a park. No, I mean, it's really funny. I tell this story, and the mugging is now such an inconsequential part of it that it doesn't really register with me that it was a big event. So I was mugged in a park. It was three young people who ended up taking a knife to me and then stealing my wallet, my phone, and no scar, thankfully, which is really good. Yeah. It's funny because for about a month after that, there were definitely some experiences. Like it was in the park where I would walk just regularly, so I'd been there loads by that point. And I would say for about a month after going to that park, like you would feel it in your body. You'd be like, "Oh, I am safe. I feel like really uneasy being here. Like my limbs feel a bit weak and my heart is kind of moving." That lasted for about a month. And after that, it kind of like eased off and I kept going and that was okay. At the same time, that was a kind of inciting incident for mental health experiences. So that kind of anxiety that I felt beforehand to kind of erupt a little bit. And so I ended up having an experience of psychosis following it. And the period after that moved very, very quickly. I remember really clearly after that, I was with the ambulance. At the same time, he saw my kind of personal reaction to it and he recommended, "Hey, I also think you should chat to your GP or someone about just the mental health aspects of it because that can be really tough." And so I did, and I went to see my GP, and then I don't remember what that conversation went like. I think I essentially just talked about how anxious and about how I was feeling. But I remember her looking very concerned. And so she passed me off to another specialist who passed me off to another specialist. And in a span, I think, of about 2 weeks, I had seen maybe 4 or 5 different people who had started asking me different questions around some of the thoughts that I was having and some of had gone into voice hearing at that point. Yeah. And so asking me around that. Yeah. And by the end of it, I'd seen all of these different people, couldn't tell you what their roles were or what they were focused on, but ended up with a misdiagnosis, actually, I should say now, but a diagnosis at the time of paranoid schizophrenia. And I think, started on my journey with schizophrenia, which is, sounds like a tale book title, is a real tricky one. I think it's still on my file. I think it is still technically my diagnosis. It's absolutely not the experience I mean, even like hearing, I mean, I think I am not in their shoes. I don't have that skill set, that knowledge. And so it's a complete assumption, me like speaking to it. I would say, and this was also over 10 years ago now, but I would say that experience of anxiety that I had and the relationship to my thoughts that I had, which was very persistent, very persecutory, and very constant. And it felt out of my control. It felt like external. At the time, I would have told you, oh, yeah, no, there is another person in my mind and it doesn't feel like me. And of course, like a doctor or clinician hearing that goes a certain direction. That's actually like quite like the experience itself hasn't changed over the years. How I would describe it and how I would frame it has quite dramatically. But at the time I was 21. I didn't know what was happening. And so I was kind of swept up into this again, NHS system, so a system under stress. Saw again, yeah, 4 or 5 different specialists. It's funny, like years later, because the misdiagnosis conversation happened around 3 or 4 years after that point. I was back in New Zealand. I had gone through early psychosis intervention, so epi, and at the end of that relationship, the psychologist, I think, I might be misspeaking there, but the person I was working with, who was seeing me on a weekly basis, ended that I was aging out of the service at 25, and she was like, really enjoyed our time together, all of that kind of stuff. Here are the next steps. We're going to make sure that you have someone that this continues, which was wonderful. Epi in general was wonderful. And at the end, our very last session together, she says, I just want to let you know as well, obviously, I can't make that decision. I don't have the power to change the actual diagnosis. I think schizophrenia was wrong, and you don't have to do anything about it, but I just wanted to let you know that that's what I think. And she set me up with a psychotherapist who I am still with today, who is incredible, is by far the best support I've ever had in my life, alongside Epi. But it's the like from that point, the process of like comprehending misdiagnosis felt like real interesting mental health journey. After the misdiagnosis conversation, I started doing research around it. My worldview was shattered. Taking it back, like I received the schizophrenia diagnosis, and alongside other things, I was given the choice of, okay, we recommend that you leave or consider leaving your studies. There's inpatient support. There's more intensive support that we can give you. And it would mean changing these things, moving out of all of that kind of stuff. And at the time, my master's degree was actually going really well. I was having a really positive experience in my master's. And so my response instead was, actually, I want to stay in this. I want to use my master's degree. It was coming up to the time where we were doing our thesis. And I was like, actually, I'm going to make it the point of my thesis. There was no information around psychosis. There was no information around schizophrenia. I made it the subject matter of my thesis. I was like, okay, I can't find any information online. I'm not being told that much. And there's certainly not any personal, like lived experience stories being shared with me. So I'm going to explore it myself. So I ended up making my master's around understanding my experiences, mostly psychosis and voice hearing at that time, as well as at the end of the misdiagnosis, because that kind of takes me into where my story is now as well, and the work that I do. Yeah, so I was in London doing my masters, exploring the stuff that was happening through there through my thesis, and I was a theatrical performances research, so I ended up doing a written component and a show, and I ended up touring that show around a little bit. But yeah, I came back to New Zealand, and I enrolled. I started with epi and early psychosis intervention, and for around the 2 3 years that I was with them and that I had this show, this work, and I was exploring that identity still, it became the key defining thing of my identity. And I was starting work in lived experience at the same time and advocacy. Because I came back with that show, I reached out to a couple of people being like, hey, I have this work. I'm new to the country, or I'm back in the country. I would like to like share it with people. Do you have community members that it could resonate? I did get I got there's an award for the Harold and Jean Brooks, which it won. Um, and that was, yeah, from touring it in London. And then I came back and I wanted to do the same thing. And I was like, okay, I'm with family for support. I'm with Epi for support. I want to start working again. And I actually, one of the people I reached out to was Tammy Allen from Changing Minds. So 12, 13 years ago now was when my relationship with Changing Minds started. And essentially was through, hey, I have this show, I'd like to put it in front of people again. Can you help? And Tammy was a director and an actress as well. So she was able to support with that and passing it into community members who, and so my identity through that was being formed around this sense of diagnosis, which I think is true for a lot of people, especially in the early stages. And so 3 years later, when it was, we're like, I think this is a misdiagnosis, like my identity shattered. I thought that I was a liar. I thought that I must have been faking it. I thought that I would have been buying into it when I shouldn't have. I felt stupid. I felt angry. I felt like I had wasted like the last 3, 4 years of my life defining my work and my identity around. It was big. It was real big. And it's funny as well because like at the same time, like my friends knew me as having that part of my identity. Like they knew me as working in mental health. They knew me as creating art around my mental health. And so misdiagnosis came into the conversation. And it's interesting, like a lot of the reactions from friends were, oh, amazing, congratulations. Because for them, they saw it the same as recovery. They saw it the same as being over. And it was interesting, like charting that reaction from friends with my own, like the difference was really stark. And I mean, like years later, I mean, that kind of, I was in that for a good, at least a year, kind of navigating that, afterwards learning that the misdiagnosis rate for schizophrenia is absurdly high. It's around 30%, which is a quote that I'm pulling out of my butt from a Google search I did years ago, but is a diagnosis that is thrown around, not thrown around, that's a disservice to clinical practice, but schizophrenia, bipolar, and personality disorders, parts of and I mean, they've got so many things that kind of feed into them, like gender feeds into them and different kind of stereotypes around that. They are diagnoses that are given out not only based off of symptoms, I think, but also given out based off of the level of distress that people experience. And again, gendered. So, like the amount of men who are given psychoses or schizophrenia as a diagnosis when they are in distress, the amount of women who have BPD or bipolar diagnoses when they are in like distress. Like there's gendered stigma in there as well. Not necessarily because the experience is perfectly aligned to diagnostic criteria. Like you said, like the diagnostic criteria for schizophrenia is super wide. At the time, again, it's not my like expertise, but even just from like Googling and searching for myself, I think I remember reading that Japan and the way that they diagnose it, they weren't actually using individual labels. They were implementing like scale of psychosis symptoms. So they were looking at different ways of framing it. So there is an understanding and a sense that that label, like schizophrenia in particular, is not super useful and not fit for purpose, really. But yeah, I remember after a good like year or so of feeling horrendous around that misdiagnosis conversation. When you were 21 and you were forming like the sense of who you are and taking guesses and big swings and getting it wrong and redefining yourself. Yeah, I invested so much time into forming my identity around, because also I was starting work as a poet at the same time, and a lot of the poetry I was writing was around mental health. And this is still a kind of conversation that I think influences a lot of the work that I do, a lot of the conversations I have in my own kind of journey in therapy and everything. But a lot of the work that I did, a lot of the motivation I think I took into spaces was motivated by the fact that I thought of myself as a monster. Like I thought of myself as in different, that's a very hyperbolic statement to make, but like in different senses of, in different senses of the word, like I wasn't good at social interaction, and so I felt weird. I wasn't good at being sociable, and so I felt like a little bit of an outsider. And then going through like anxious experiences, starting to think like, oh, something is wrong with me. Like I can't human correctly. And so I think like I took to the schizophrenia diagnosis, and it was that kind of like exhaling feeling, because suddenly there was a reason for the fact that I felt like I couldn't exist properly. And there were all of these kind of answers that were framed and prepackaged and labeled and given to you. And also as well, like speak like motivation, like as someone who also wanted to understand it and wanted to and put it into my work and explore it, like there was also like a political aspect to it because once I had that diagnosis, all of the connotations around schizophrenia in media, in art, and reporting, media reporting are around violence, are around monstrous behavior and harmful behavior. And that is still true today.
It is.
And there's two kind of factors to that. One is that all of that information validated my understanding of myself as being monstrous or being a monster, being not a great human being. And also they validated that experience and also they gave me a path into advocating or fighting against something. I could move forward both by understanding my experience and also trying to fight those kind of labels and that stigmatizing. I spent a lot of time trying to tell myself that the work that I did in that time, especially just because it was based around misdiagnosis, there is like still guilt that like pops up every now and again. And some of it I think is a process of being like, nope, that's not fair. That's me being too harsh on myself. Some of it is trying to rationally kind of assess the power that I still have in those situations, which I think is a good practice for anyone to be like, cool, even if I'm not in a position of power, what agency do I still have? Which has affected some of the conversations I've had, like with my GP, with doctors, clinicians, like following, which has been really powerful. Ironically, as well, like the guilt thing, something that's been really, really useful, or as like a question for me, and it sounds quite judgmental, but it's actually not. Like, it started off being like, how can I be a little bit less selfish in this interaction? Because there was an aspect of that me feeling guilty that felt selfish as well. It has since changed. The language that I use has shifted a little bit to be like, how can I decenter myself? Which is, I think, a little bit kinder, a little bit more useful to be like, cool, when I feel especially guilty around the misdiagnosis, I'm putting myself in the center of it. I'm putting myself in like a key position in relation to friends and family and my work and stuff. Rounding it off, I actually think like that influence in terms of what pushed me into performing or pushed me into directing and facilitating and any of it, like the feeling, and it was heightened in the schizophrenia and the misdiagnosis, that kind of stage of the journey as well. But like so much of my feeling in spaces has been like, I am at fault here. I'm doing something wrong. I am a monster, or I am even like at its worst into being like I'm harmful. I will cause harm if I enter into these spaces. I think even today, a lot of the work that I do is motivated by the sense of like, if I can be open about that and I can be honest about that, that then lets me go into spaces and set up processes or set up space or relationships in a way where if anyone else is feeling that, or for any reason, there are loads of reasons that I think people can come into a space with that kind of those kind of feelings. But if anyone is coming into a space with that kind of feeling, I can acknowledge it, that it's in the room without kind of changing it or kind of counter it or say, no, 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 there's no digit. Like I can actually just let it exist in the room and then create a process around it that goes, cool, wherever this has come from, it is clearly an aspect of your humanity. It is clearly something that like the world and who you are as a person and the relationships you have and where you exist in relation to other people, all of those things together means that you've shown up to this space carrying this stuff and it feels really difficult, but we can create a process that holds it and holds it honestly and with dignity. I think is actually a really beautiful word because it encompasses so much, but we can hold it with that dignity and acknowledge that it's a human experience and we can still work in a meaningful way acknowledging all of that. So yeah, that mindset through line, that thread through all of it, I